One of the more challenging problems I run into when auditing sites are otherwise valid URLs with extra parameters or query strings added. For example, here are some parameter URLs I found on my website. Now, you can find these types of URLs in lots of different places. You might find them in search rankings. You might find them in Google Search Console's page indexing report. You might find these types of URLs in log files or backlinks. The question is, when you find these, is if they're a problem. And sometimes parameter URLs like this can create lots of problems. One common problem is simply that it requires bots to crawl way too many URLs on your website. If you have tons and tons of URLs with all these different parameters attached, that's going to mean that Google's bots and bots from AI tools as well end up wasting server resources, crawling stuff they just don't need to crawl. If these URLs are reported under duplicate without user selected canonical in Google Search Console's page indexing report, then these URLs are likely being treated as problematic duplicate content, and that can reduce overall site quality, which can hold back a website's performance in search results. Another problem is that problematic parameters on URLs can change how visits are tracked in GA4 or other analytics tools. For example, let's say that you have a bunch of URLs with social media tracking parameters end up indexed in organic search results. So now in organic search results, we have URLs ranking with tracking parameters that will say this particular URL or this particular click came from a social media site. So in that case, GA4 or some other web analytics tool is going to track the visit as if it's from social media and not organic search. That distorts our understanding of performance and how well organic search might be working. Bad parameters can also sometimes break how the page loads. So if you add a certain parameter to the page, or there's a certain value in that parameter, then all of a sudden the page doesn't load correctly. And that can end up with incomplete content or just flat out broken pages that create a bad user experience. Now, that's all the various problems that can happen, but let me be clear here that sometimes parameters are necessary and not a problem at all. You might need to append parameters to the URL in order for the page to load correctly. One good example of this is pagination. For example, adding $page equals 2 to the URL might be necessary in order to load the second page of results. That's not a problematic parameter, that's a necessary parameter on your website. So when you see these types of URLs, what you need to do is go through and determine which of these parameters are necessary and important and something that is required for your website to load correctly, and which of these parameters are a problem and causing some type of issue for Google or other bots visiting your website. Once you've filtered out the ones that are a problem from the ones that are necessary, you now need to step through all the problematic ones and figure out, what do you do with them? How do you handle all of these parameters to prevent or fix problems that might be happening? And we have a few options we can consider when it comes to managing parameters. The first of those options is a canonical tag. So a canonical tag tells Google which URL is the official version. So with a canonical tag, you can tell Google whether those parameters are part of the official site structure or not. Now, this is what you want to do for valid parameters that are a necessary part of the site. For example, pages that maybe require a valid parameter of category equals. In the parameter string, in order to load category content, that would need to be in the canonical tag, right? You would want to tell Google that, hey, a URL with category equals whatever, that's the official version of that tag. And therefore, we want you to treat that as the official version and include that URL in search results. But you can also use a canonical tag to remove parameters that are attached to URLs. For example, pages with tracking parameters would canonical to the non-parameter version of that page. So that way, if Google finds a URL with, say, those social media tracking parameters attached, Google would know, oh, I can ignore those social media tracking parameters because the canonical told me to do that. Now, the downside to the canonical is Google has a long history of ignoring these. Not all the time, but I've seen a lot of inconsistencies over the years with Google indexing non-canonical versions of the URL. So for example, Google might index pages that have parameters attached on their URL, even though the canonical tag says not to do that. Now, this can be an outlier, so I always recommend starting here to try and fix the problems, but it's something to keep an eye out for and see if that happens on your website. Now, another option we have is a no index tag. So if you add a no index tag to the URLs that include parameters, you're telling Google, hey, if you see a URL with these parameters, keep it out of the index, keep it out of search results. This can be effective, especially if you have lots of pages ranking in search results with problematic parameters. The downside is that once you tell Google to remove it from search results, Google will remove it from search results, but they won't replace it with another page. So if that page with all those parameters was ranking pretty highly or driving traffic to the website, all of a sudden setting it to no index can be pretty disruptive for your SEO performance. So it's something to step through and think about, but it may not always be the right answer. Typically, you only want to set the no index for low value pages that don't need to rank at all, that you're not counting on to drive any SEO value. The next option we have is redirecting URLs with parameters. This is typically my preferred solution. So if a URL is loaded with any extra or necessary parameters, you can configure your website server to redirect that URL to a version of the URL without those parameters. For example, you could redirect mypage.html garbage equals 1234 to just mypage.html, right? We dropped garbage equals 1234 from the URL with that redirect. This can be tricky to configure, but if you can pull it off and you can actually implement this, it solves a lot of the problems around problematic parameters. One big problem it solves is it reduces duplicate content. That's because you're redirecting from one URL to another. You're never giving bots the opportunity to see that that URL with the parameters was a valid functioning page on the website. The other thing that redirects often do is they update rankings. So if you do have pages ranking in organic search results with a bunch of parameters attached, by redirecting those to a version without those parameters, Google will see the redirect and then often update that ranking automatically instead of you having to index it and then build back a ranking somewhere else through optimizing another page. The other problem that a redirect solves is it prevents parameters from loading at all. So if those parameters, when attached to the URL, loaded an incorrect or broken page, or if those parameters distorted analytics, well, by redirecting it, you're preventing the website from ever loading with those parameters. And as a result, you won't get that broken page. You won't have distorted analytics data either. Another option we have is a 404. This is really similar to the redirect option, but instead of redirecting the URL with the parameters, you are telling the server to return a 404 error if certain parameters are appended to the URL. So for example, if I've got mypage.html, garbage equals 1234, I can tell my server to return a 404 when that URL with that parameter is loaded. So that way users and bots will see a 404 error when they load that URL with that parameter. But if that URL without the parameter is loaded, then the regular page is returned. This solves all the same problems as redirecting the parameter URLs, but it has the extra advantage that over time, Google and other bots should start to crawl these parameter URLs less. That's because they tend to crawl 404 errors less over time. There can be some implementation problems here. There can also be some potential problems with user experience, particularly if users end up getting a lot more 404s. So it's something to keep an eye out for if you do go this route. Another option we have is we can simply ignore the parameters that exist. Sure, they might be causing a problem, but if the problems aren't that severe, you can simply ignore the parameters and just leave them alone. This isn't always the right choice because a small problem today can become a bigger problem tomorrow. So you could just fix it now while it's smaller, but we have to pick and choose between what all we can actually do on our website. And sometimes it's just not high priority enough to warrant fixing it relative to all the other things that we have to do. So you can safely ignore it if the problem isn't so bad. Now, I'm going to guess that some of you are thinking, what about a disallow in the robots.txt file? We could set a disallow statement to say, hey, don't crawl URLs with all these parameters attached. That's usually a bad option and not one I would recommend. And that's because Google can still index and rank URLs that are not crawled. So even if you've said in the robots.txt file, disallow anything with this particular parameter, Google may still come across those URLs somewhere else, right? Maybe they're in links on your website, backlinks somewhere else on the web. Maybe Google just has those in their history. And so Google knows about those URLs and so still may try to put those in rankings. I agree, this is kind of a weird behavior from Google, but I've seen a lot of instances of this where Google indexes and ranks bad URL parameters, even though they can't crawl them. So the better answer is to let Google crawl these URLs and then tell Google what to do with them once they do crawl these URLs. So by letting Google crawl the URL, Google will be able to see the canonical tag or the no index tag or the redirect or the error message you're returning on that parameter URL. So Google actually knows what to do with it. And if you don't want them to include it in search results, they won't, based on the instructions they see during a crawl. There's obviously a lot here to think about when it comes to managing and handling parameters on your website. So if you have questions, please let me know. You can email me at matthew@elementive.com. If you liked this video, please hit the like button below. Or if you'd like more videos like this with tips and tricks about technical SEO, please follow or subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.